The podcast is Going to the Conspiracy, featuring Auckland's Josh Addison and Bucharest's Dr. Matthew R. X. Dentith.
Hello, you're listening to the podcast's Guide to the Conspiracy. I'm Josh Addison in Auckland, New Zealand. He's Dr. Matthew Dentith in Bucharest, Romania. And this episode, we're trying something a little bit different, perhaps. Would you like to elaborate,
We're trying to
Matthew?
make ourselves... So we're trying to make ourselves punchier. So the plan is when I return back to Auckland in a fortnight's time, we are going to make a go of making this podcast into a half-hour video show. Now that doesn't mean the podcast is disappearing. There'll still be an audio version of the show available online, but we are going to try and do a kind of in-studio face-to-face chat video version of the podcast as well. And so as preparation for that, we're going for a slimmed down episode this week, because Josh and I, discussing this after the show last week, were of the firm opinion that getting people to watch us for an hour doesn't really work. If we're going to go for a video podcast, we really need to be going for a half-hour show. So this week, we're going to attempt to make ourselves slim, trim, and ultimately punchable. Sorry, punchy. Not punchable, punchy.
Oh, I don't know, I could go either way. Now, see, I would have said just like your mum then, but we've called an end to the your mum joke because it was just getting a little bit overbearing, I think. So pretend I never said a word. So yes, with that in mind, we'll be foregoing the little sketches at the start for the time being, perhaps, because while they work nicely in a sort of radio play kind of way, on video it's two guys sitting there staring at scripts in their hands, reciting their lines, so probably slightly less compelling.
Yes, it'll look like two people feeling very pleased about themselves reading out a sketch that no one else is laughing to.
Exactly. Now, I suppose we should also say that as you point out, you'll be back in New Zealand and we'll be able to record these together very, very soon. So what exactly are your travel plans over the next couple of weeks?
So, I leave Bucharest on Monday. I'm then spending a few days in London, because people will be aware that Monday is the 11th of September, and my flight plan is Bucharest to London, London to LA, LA to Auckland. And because when you travel over the United States, you have to basically enter the United States, there's no way that I want to spend my time crossing the American border on September the 11th.
Yes.
So instead, I'll spend a few days in London, leave London on the 14th, and arrive back in Auckland on the early Saturday morning of the 16th of September. So there'll be no podcast/vodcast next week, because I will be enjoying my holiday in London in preparation for my very, very, very long flight home.
And then the week after that, I guess we'll see, depending on how you find your feet back here and whatever you're doing, getting used to the swing of Antipodean life. But we may have one
And
in 2 weeks'
whether or
time,
not
or who
I
knows.
have jet lag.
Well, yes,
you never
I
know.
expect it's probably hard to avoid. Anyway, in the spirit of being punchy and quick-paced, shall we move on to our slimmed-down, fast-paced news section?
We shall.
Breaking conspiracy theories in the news.
So, in news which rather makes a mockery of views we expressed a few weeks ago, it turns out that the Kenyan election was not above board, and their Supreme Court has declared the election result null and void, claiming it had not been conducted in accordance with the Constitution. The verdict was backed by 4 of the 6 Supreme Court judges, although the President of Kenya has declared them to be crooks.
The blame seems to sit not on the ruling party, but rather the Election Commission had committed irregularities in the transmission of results. This does not mean the results were rigged, but it does indicate something shady in the running of that election.
Now, returning to one of our earlier stories, a Malaysian diplomat, Zayed Raza, murdered in Madagascar on August 24th of this year, was tasked with transporting pieces of suspected MH370 wreckage to investigators in Malaysia. American adventurer detective Blaine Gibson claims to have been receiving death threats about his work collecting suspected MH370 debris, which has been washing up on the coast of Madagascar and Mozambique. He suspects that Raza was slain by the people responsible for those threats.
Now, I should say we have been decided to sort of pre-script these news things to keep it fast, and so we don't get bogged down in digressions, which is the only reason why I'm not questioning the use of the phrase adventure detective, because I really want to know what one of those is. Nevertheless, we'll put that to the side.
I have a feeling it's self-declared adventure detective.
Yes. Anyway, back on script. However, others have speculated that the real reason Mr. Raza was killed was payback for his alleged involvement in the 2009 abduction of several residents of Indo-Pakistani descent known as Karens. Suspected of having participated in the abductions, he was imprisoned in Madagascar, but was able to return to Malaysia in December 2010, provoking indignation within the Karen community.
Now, we haven't talked about Pizzagate for a while, but someone who has been talking about it is Minecraft creator Marcus Notch Pearson. Admittedly, his promotion of Pizzagate is a tad confusing. After tweeting that
Pizzagate is real.
He followed it up with the claim,
and the kicker is that none of this gets reported in the media. People focus on actually proven conspiracies like the Russia nonsense.
tweeted,
"A very obvious attempt at a race war is being manufactured by the media, and the goddamned retarded alt-right and alt-left fuel that fire."
More fuel for last week.
So, two bits of Trump news, and all from the same article at Politico. The first is that we now have good evidence that Trump, despite claims from him and his campaign team, had an active interest in Russian business affairs in the lead up to the election, notably the development of a Trump Tower in Moscow, something Trump was personally briefed on at least 3 times. The second comes from the first. The people at Politico are suggesting that we refer to the Russia collusion scandal as Trump Tower. Personally, we like this moniker as it respects the way in which the Watergate scandal or affair became known as Watergate. We're referring to the central object the scandal concerns. Trump Tower it should be. It's the new Watergate.
And that, as they say, was the news.
Look at that, see, short, punchy, to the point. We fairly flew through that news update, taking up practically no time at all. If we made it any shorter, I think we would have actually gone backwards in time and started before we finished, or finished before we started. Time would have gone
wonky.
Wonky.
It would have been very confusing for the editing of the audio if we were in fact going back in time. I actually don't know how to edit an audio podcast where events occur before the recording has even started.
No, I'm sure tachyons would be involved. Now, as well as being the start of a potential new format, this episode is going to be the start of a new little, what would we call it, theme, perhaps, that we just want to look at over the next few weeks. We're going to be looking at a bunch of false flag events, which we love to talk about because they happen all the time, and we go on and on and on and on and on about them. But we're going to be talking about some real, actual, documented false flag events that we know happened for sure for really, really reals. Why are we looking at these, Matthew? Is this because people have been saying, how come you keep laughing at silly conspiracy theories when are you going to talk about some real ones?
In part, it's because I feel that we've been making more fun of conspiracy theories than actually arguing that we should treat conspiracy theories seriously. Also in part because as I've been working on evidential issues with respect to these things called conspiracy theories, I've been collecting a list of actual cases of false flags which show that conspiracies on a governmental level do occur with some frequency. And I think it would be useful to talk about actual false flag events as part of that evidential concern. Because one of the issues we have when we talk about conspiracy theories is people say, but what's the evidence that conspiracies are common? And often you'll get these lists online of false flag events. And when you fisk those lists, you often find that the false flag events in question are only purported false flags. But in amongst those lists are examples of actual false flag events where the government of one country performs an event and then blames another country for doing it, usually as a pretext for some further event. And I think it would be really useful to focus on some of these examples to show that these events do happen and that conspiracy theorists are right to be concerned about false flag events, because false flag events do occur.
And so the particular false flag event that we're going to be talking about today is the shelling of Mainila. I'm not quite certain of the pronunciation, but I assume it must be something like that. Mainila, which...
I'm also not quite sure of the pronunciation either.
It was a small town on the border, inside Russia, but on the border of Russia and Finland. It was shelled on November the 26th, 1939, at which point Russia declared that the fire had originated from Finland, across the nearby border, claimed that Russians had been killed, and basically that was their excuse for starting what's referred to as the Winter War, the portion at the start of conflict at the start of World War II, where Russia started moving into Finland. That was something that I found interesting, because I don't really... You sort of think World War II was, it started here and it finished here, but there were sort of little conflicts all simmering around that eventually merged into one, into the great amoeba that we know as World War II, and this was sort of one of them. But it's interesting.
Yes, because what's really quite interesting about this is, of course, in the build-up to what we call World War II, there were, of course, many of the European powers trying to make pacts with one another and treaties with one another to make sure that if there was a conflict, people would be on the right side, so to speak. And of course, one of the more interesting agreements was, of course, between Germany and Russia. And so you have a situation where when Germany starts performing actions in Europe or the European theatre, Russia is also performing actions in that theatre, in part because they've already made an agreement with Germany at that point in time as to how they're going to divide Europe once the conflicts are over.
Now, I said Russia claimed that the village had been attacked by the Finns across the border of Finland and Russia.
I do like the idea that a military action by the Finns is Finnish.
Yes,
so
I think
when the Finns attack, they Finn.
Yes, they come and bomb the shit out of you and say, "Hey, you've just been Finned." I would do that.
Yeah.
If I were the Finnish army, that is actually what I would do. But we know it was not the Finnish army. There was no Finning involved whatsoever in this particular shelling. We know it was that the Red Army did it. We know that now. How do we know that now?
Well, we know that because of the work of historians. So historians who looked into the act of aggression noted that there appeared to be no Russian casualties reported on November 26 and the days afterwards. So that indicated that whatever the story Russia told about the shelling was in fact incorrect. But we also know that because Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev wrote that the Manila shellings were organized by Artillery Marshal Grigory Kulak, and that Russian President Boris Yeltsin denounced the Winter War, agreeing it had been a war of aggression on Russia's part. So it has become part of the official narrative after the fact that Russia has taken responsibility for the shelling.
Now, of course, at the time, Finland protested. Finland claimed actually that there was no artillery anywhere in range that would have been able to reach that village, and I believe they'd actually deliberately withdrawn their artillery, essentially so that something like this couldn't happen. Russia, of course, was having none of that. They said, nope, it was you, it was the Finns, deal's off, we can invade you now.
Yes, now we should point out the reason why this happened was that Russia and Finland had a non-aggression treaty, which had been first signed, I believe, in 1920, and then in 1932 had been renewed for 10 years. So Russia's interest in Finland, because Finland is on the border of Russia, and Russia would like to have a comfort space, basically, to make sure that in any conflict, Russia cannot be attacked directly. Russia wanted Finland as part of its empire, Now, Russia had made entreaties towards the Balkan states, sorry, not the Balkan states, the Baltic states, so Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, and basically got them on board. And as we know, what happened is that eventually Russia took over those states up until the latter part of the 20th century. But Finland was having nothing to do with this. They wanted to remain independent. Now, because of this non-aggression pact, Russia was not in the position to be able to preemptively take over Finland. They needed what's known as a casus belli, or a justification for war, i.e. to be able to invade Finland, they needed to show that Finland was being aggressive towards them, which would legally allow them to retaliate. And thus the false flag event was useful for portraying Finland as the aggressor, and thus legally justifying Russia's aggression in the Winter War towards Finland.
Yes, which I find interesting to begin with. So this is, this is the situation. Then we have what we know to have been a false flag attack, and we know that the motive for it was to provide the pretext for an invasion. I find it interesting that countries, I guess, feel the need to do this. If you're going to invade a country, why do you, why bother? You're going to invade them, you're going to conquer them. Why make up a story about it in the first place? I suppose, is it just simply for sort of ongoing ramifications afterwards, if people start claiming you shouldn't have done that and give that land back and so on, once the dust is all settled? Is it simply so that they're trying to sort of, dot the I's and cross the T's, so that afterwards they can say, yes, everything we did was completely legitimate. We didn't, we only did what we were forced to do. Is it just plain ass covering, or is there anything deeper behind it?
Basically, yes. So we have the UN now, the United Nations, and the United Nations is in theory the body which you have to go to justify your act of aggression towards another country. Prior to the formation of the United Nations, of course, there was the League of Nations. And in a situation where there was an unjust war, there were legal repercussions for that. So essentially, a state could sue another state for aggression which was unwarranted, which is why you needed these things, the casus belli, to be able to show that, look, they were aggressive towards us, so they were in the wrong. Thus, that gives us our justification for war. When you lack a justification for war, you're basically an illegal aggressor, and the state which you have been aggressive towards is able to then have restitution afterwards. Whilst if you have a warrant for war, a casus belli, your justification, you can go, well, you don't get any reparation. You were the aggressive party in the first place. We were simply defending ourselves.
And so in that case, this is basically the classic false flag, the archetypal false flag, where a government wants to pursue a certain strategy, has a particular agenda, knows they don't quite have the justification or the legal, I suppose, standing to do it, so therefore engineers an incident to give them at least the appearance of justification and the appearance of legality, while they set about doing the thing that they always wanted to do in the first place. So I can certainly see why, when people were asked, how can you show that, how can you justify the claim that false flags happen all the time and that they're common, why people would point to an incident such as this. I actually found it interesting reading about it. One of the points they note is they mentioned the Gleiwitz incident, which we'll probably talk about next episode, because it's another interesting and quite sort of archetypical example of a false flag. This was a false flag.
And it features our good friends, the Nazis, and good friends there should be in air quotes.
Yes. Our Nazis are not our friends. If I met a Nazi, I would say, you, sir, you're not my friend. Unless what was the situation from last week? You threw him in a river and then rescued him and then threw him in a river again? Allegedly, yes. I assume that's the some sort of double baptism theory removes Nazism.
I like the idea of the
A double baptism. When a regular
theory
baptism
is
won't
able to
take, you need a double baptism, or super baptism, as they're sometimes known.
always double baptize your Nazis just to be sure.
At any rate, yes, no. So this is something we'll talk about next week, which happened in Nazi Germany, and which some people have claimed was inspiration in part for this particular false flag incident. The Russians had seen what happened in Germany and said, "Oh, that plan's just so crazy, it just might work." Another interesting thing, though, I noticed was that Soviet war games had apparently been held in 1938 and also earlier in 1939, which were based on a scenario where border incidents at pretty much this exact same place in Mainila would have sparked the war. So they had these plans, they'd done training exercises based on the scenario of a border incident in this exact spot starting a war, and then, wouldn't you know it, a border incident in this spot sparks a war. And that's something that seems to crop up in false flag conspiracy theories all the time. There are always these claims, whether or not they're true, I'm not quite certain in most cases, but there are always claims that that some sort of training event for this exact event happened like a very short amount of time before the real event happened. So they say that in sort of the false flags, the mass shootings in the States, when people claim that they're a false flag. I've seen in the case of numerous incidents, people claim that there was a police training activity in simulating a mass shooting in this particular area. I think pretty sure they said the thing. They said that about. I've completely forgot it. The school shooting.
The Sandy Hook massacre.
Sandy Hook. Completely fell out of my mind. I'm sure I've seen that about Sandy Hook. I seem to remember seeing it about the nightclub shooting in Florida. It's kind of becoming a standard feature. And yet this very definitely does seem to be the case in this one. So again, we can sort of see an example of when people are looking for a prototypical example. This seems to be quite a good one, and I have to wonder if it's things like this that people kind of use as a template when they're coming up with false flag conspiracy theories. Did this sort of did this sort of give people the idea of what a false flag should look like?
I certainly think it's part of the calculus that people use when they're talking about, look, past behavior predicts current or future behavior. I mean, so if we look at the stories about Operation Jade Storm, which was the military training exercise going on in the US 1 or 2 years ago, and this was a case of the military performing maneuvers on American soil as practice for wars overseas, and certain people are going, look, this is simply a pretext for the American military and FEMA taking over the US. So the fact that there are these military exercises occurring in areas that people think are going to be under threat anyway, then gets used as, look, they're preparing us, or preparing themselves, for an event on our soil, which they will of course attribute to some foreign actor. And of course the other interesting example, and we might want to talk about this in depth in a later episode, is of course that many people will point out that events like the London bombing and 9/11 all have training exercises associated with them in close proximity to the event. So the fact that in this particular Finnish case, Russia was engaging in training exercises which roughly simulated the shelling, and then the shelling miraculously occurred, thus justifying the Winter War, people will go, well, look, governments have past behavior which predicts that they might be doing these things again here and now.
So yes, I think some people possibly take that line of argumentation too far and will say, look, it must have happened because look, it's happened before. That's possibly overreaching, but it's certainly an example such as the shelling of Mainila allows you to say this does happen. This indeed has happened. We know it has happened. So rather than making the sort of positive claim that because it's happened in the past, it must have, it must be a false flag now, it does work as a counter to claims if you were to come up with a false flag theory, and someone would say, well, this is ridiculous, this couldn't happen. Something like this is useful because it allows you to counter those sorts of claims, say, well, no, this does happen, and it has happened, and I can show you that it has happened right now.
Yeah, and thus it gives you justification for going, look, we should at least entertain the hypothesis and investigate events of this kind happening here and now.
So there you have it. The shelling of Mainila, a proper false flag event, a false flag in wartime even, which is when the sort of the false flag, the whole phrase really kind of originated. And I'm pretty sure when we first, we did an episode devoted to false flags quite some time ago now, and I'm pretty sure at the time when we said, you do actually see a bunch of them happen in war times. It is quite it's has its grounds in a military tactic, and of course people will claim it's used in against civilian targets these days. And does it count as civilian if it's government agencies doing it, like the FBI? Certainly not in wartime anyway. Yeah. So it's a real false flag. It happened. It's there. We know about it. So I suppose before we wrap things up, is there any more you would like to say about this specific event?
Not particularly. I mean, I think it's interesting when we think about what's going on in Russia at the time. So of course we have the Moscow show trials, which had occurred earlier in that decade. Then we have the events going on along the Russian-Finnish border, and of course the common denominator in both these cases is Stalin and Stalin's wishes. Stalin wanted to find evidence that there were traitors within Russia, so we get the Moscow show trials. Stalin wanted the Baltic states and Finland, and so engaged initially in diplomacy to try and get those states on Russia's side, and then went, well, diplomacy isn't working out, so we're going to manufacture a crisis. And certainly in retrospect, Stalin turns out to be the kind of leader who wasn't very trustworthy and engaged in activities that many of us now consider to be a little bit rum. And so it is actually quite interesting looking at how these events were treated at the time, when Stalin was still considered to be a respectable leader, and of course the way that it's now become accepted wisdom that what Stalin did was bad, and so these things were predictable. We've kind of done a post facto explanation. At the time, Stalin was respectable, so we doubt that these were false trials or false flags. Now, of course, we know the extent of what happened in Soviet Russia under Stalin's regime, and we go, well, of course it was a false flag. Of course the trials were sham trials. That's the kind of thing that Stalin was up to.
So as a more general summation, and sort of to set the theme for this little series that we'll be going over for the next, I don't know, some episodes. This isn't about to be the podcaster's guide to false flag conspiracy theories exclusively, but it'll be a theme for just a little while now.
That would be a bit of a mouthful.
It really would. Must not say just like your mum. Yes, but generally, as an overall project, as you say, we can look at this after the fact and see. Obviously, knowing now what we do, we can say that these things are clearly false flags. But I guess is the project here to say how we evaluate claims in the here and now that something is a false flag? Is that what we're wanting to sort of work towards?
It is part of the story. Because of course, one of the issues in events in wartime is that much of the information that we need to be able to evaluate these events really only comes out well after the fact. I mean, especially when you have a very closed isolationist nation like Russia, it's very hard to get information about what happened during those conflicts until years and sometimes decades after the event. But of course, at the time, people were suspicious. The Dewey Commission was suspicious about the Moscow show trials. People in Finland, of course, were very suspicious about the act of aggression they had supposedly performed with regard to Russia. But proving those things in the moment turns out to be rather difficult. And it's very easy to dismiss these claims as being mere conspiracy theories because state actors, like the Soviet government, deny them. And of course, they have the kind of official authority where you'd go, well, you know, Stalin, he's a good chap. Stalin wouldn't lie to us about this, so it must be the Finnish who are being deceitful at this particular moment in time.
Yes, so having ammunition to be able to say that false flags do occur, false flags occur at the government level and are an example of a governmental conspiracy, can be useful in evaluating claims of false flags yet to come.
And actually, I just thought of one other point, going back to the earlier point I made about Germany and Russia deciding to carve up Europe, and I've momentarily forgotten the full name of the pact they signed, so it's the Ribbentrop something pact. And of course, that was a pact that Germany and Russia colluded to in secret. So they had got together and went, well, look, after all this is done, Europe will be divided up in this particular way. And of course, we didn't know about that for quite some time. So we weren't aware that Russia had gone to Germany or Germany had gone to Russia and gone, look, once this is all over and done with, you get this bit, we get that bit, which of course to those governments then, to their minds, legitimized what they were going to do because they had an agreement with another foreign power. This was how things were going to play out.
Yes. So, I guess that's about it for the main topic for this episode, and I see we're just bumping up on half an hour now, so maybe now's a good time to call things to a close. So let's do that.
Indeed.
So we can do that by saying you've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, new improved 50% slimmer non-fattening version. My name's Josh.
And no extra salt.
No, none whatsoever. We made quite certain of that. You don't want to know how. My name's Josh Addison. I'm conveniently located in Auckland, New Zealand. You can reach me on Twitter with the name Monkey Fluids if you're so inclined.
I would like to actually point out that for our Northern Hemisphere listeners, you actually aren't conveniently located because you're in the Southern Hemisphere in a country which can take up to 17 hours to get to by plane.
An island nation that can only be reached by aeroplane or slow boat, I guess.
Or submarine, or hovercraft.
Yeah, yes, I suppose, technically. Surfboard, if you're Patrick Swayze at the end of Point Break. I mean, he said he couldn't, but we all know he was lying.
Yeah, and we're all secretly Patrick Swayze at the end of Point Break.
In a fashion, yes. Nevertheless, this other fellow is Dr. Matthew R. X. Dentith, conveniently located in Bucharest, Romania. I assume convenient if you're somewhere Europe or Europe adjacent. You can reach him on Twitter with the handle Conspiracism. Or you could, and I certainly recommend that you do, go to his website episto.org. Where you'll find mirrors of this podcast and all manner of tomfoolery and whiz-bangery and horse feathers
and frippery
and frippery or frippery.
Both.
Okay.
But no drapery.
No, obviously.
Not yet,
no,
anyway.
no, that would just be foolish and irresponsible. This podcast is available on iTunes. You may be aware of that because you're listening to it on iTunes right now, but what you might not know is that it's also on Stitcher. It's also on a bunch of other places. I think those two seem to be the big ones at the moment. It's hosted, its real home is of course podbean.com, so you can go to conspiracism.podbean.com to find the, what would you call it, official version, the progenitor version, the seed from which our podcast...
The homepage?
The homepage, yeah, that's possibly much more pithy and to shorten to the point, which is the entire point of this episode. I think it's the lot. Is that the lot?
It is. That is basically the end. And the end has been prepared for with a song, I believe.
Yes, so when it comes to full-on, proper, legitimate video episodes, maybe going out on a song won't work quite as well because it will just sort of be the two of us sitting there just kind of twiddling our thumbs for 4 minutes while a track goes. But we're not quite there yet. This is still a podcast first and foremost. So we can finish with the song. The song we're playing this week is Running. It is by Jens East featuring Elske. And it sounds good. so listen to it, damn you.
And it is basically Finn adjacent.
Yes, I don't know. Jens, that sounds. Is that a Swedish name? I don't know too much about my European nomenclature, but it's certainly.
It's Northern Europe.
Yes, it's somewhere in the region. So it'll do. Just like your mum. Right. No, I'll have this licked by next episode. I'm sure it won't come up again. So. Are we all done? Is there anything more to say?
No, apart from the fact that you've been finned.
I sure have. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
You've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, starring Josh Addison and Matthew R.X. Dentith, and produced by Matthew R.X. Dentith. If you've enjoyed the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, why not contribute to our Patreon or Podbean patron page? And you can contact us on podcastconspiracy@gmail.com. That's podcastconspiracy@gmail.com.
I'll let you up and tie you down, so you'll be here, won't sneak around. I'll lace you up and put you on. Running for you every day and night. I'm running for you, gotta move, don't want no ride. So warm me up, cause I know the world is at my feet, yeah. So take me higher, baby, let's go and hit the streets, yeah. So I'll keep running for you. So I'll keep running for you.
I think I detect the makings of a catchphrase, Matthew.
I think we definitely have a catchphrase in the making. Unless our one Finnish listener gets in contact and says that's inappropriate, at which point it'll be done. It'll be done.
Yeah. Oh well, what can you do?